Then we came back here, and the first day back in the office was a Monday, and the earthquake was Tuesday. And then, of course, came Irene, and then came floods. And now, I don't know what we're going to call this. So it does feel, I'm wondering whether the locusts are coming next. And maybe I'm Typhoid Mary, and everything is...
The rats are becoming aggressive in subways.
What's that?
The rats are also becoming
Oh, the rats are
aggressive.
becoming, that's right. Hey. Hey. Maybe Michelle Bachmann is right.
About what?
Well, God doesn't like what we're doing, so we're getting over. Forget it.
What we're
Forget
doing.
it.
So he's going to give us Michelle Bachmann?
Forget it. Well, Sean said he would be here to chair, but so I guess we can start with that.
All right. I'm Sean Costigan.
Well, we have a few new people who haven't been here before. Maybe we should just quickly go around and identify. I'm David Gold. I teach here.
Bill Hartung. I'm at the Center for International Policy, and I'm a co-founder of the study group.
That's right.
Amy Orr, I just started at the new school a couple weeks ago, a graduate program in international affairs, and focusing on development.
Luis Bruca, just a new student. I'm Bain, and my master's in international affairs with concentration on conflict and security.
Well, my name is Richard Hayden. I'm a first year GPIA student. I just started a couple weeks ago too, and I'm probably going to have my concentration in conflict and security.
Rudolph Hauser, retired, formerly economist with Oppenheimer Capital.
I'm Lee Siegel. I do work on North Korea.
Devin Entropin, I'm actually now a third year GPI student. But,
Two and a half.
Two and a half. I'm finishing up my thesis this semester, and then I'll be finished up, but I'm also David Gold's RA. So.
Okay. As all of you know, we had the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I was just recalling with Bill that I think we did something on the 5th anniversary, including the two of us. So maybe we're starting a precedent. We'll be back for the 15th and the 20th.
All right. What we said then is even truer now. If I could remember what we said.
Remember what we said. But I thought it would be useful, given that everyone else was talking about the last 10 years, that we weigh in on it. Let me first, we are going to continue with our,
That's the real one.
the real Sean Costigan is here. Sean is our third co-chair.
Hi.
And he promised to get here on time to chair.
Almost made it.
He almost made it. Okay. Almost had it. I'll let you chair in a second. I was just wanted to announce that we are going to be meeting as usual on Friday afternoons. 4 meetings this semester, 4 meetings next semester. The next meeting is October 28th. We're going to do something a little different. We have the room for 4 hours, and we're going to do hopefully 2 different panels on the UN efforts to draft and put into force a global treaty regulating the international arms trade. Now, it's going to be somewhat speculative because although the UN has been meeting and they're going to start meeting in sessions with delegates, and they anticipate a result by the end of 2012, we really have no idea what that will look like. So there will be some speculation as to what's possible, obviously some critique. Anyway, so that'll be a somewhat slightly different but along the same themes. And then we'll be meeting again on the 11th of November. Armistice Day is a good day for us to meet. And the 2nd of December. All Fridays at 2 o'clock, all right here. We have tentative dates for the spring, but I won't give them to you now. Also this room, all 4 meetings. And we don't have confirmed speakers yet for the last 2, but we are working on it. And we promised somebody, maybe Sean. No, he's already said that. So, you want to now assume the chair? Or?
Sure, yes, I can do that at the moment. Which one of you would like to speak first?
I'm going
You're going first? Well, that's easy. David, please.
We gotta assume that, we gotta pretend that he does something.
Right, there you go.
Okay. The way we've divided this is Bill's going to talk mostly about defense issues, and I'm going to raise three sort of different and related issues. The theme being, I guess the title we gave it was, I don't have the sheet with me, it's What Have We Learned Since 9/11?
Yep.
Is that the title? Okay. And my simple answer, and it's overly simple, is not much. In part because some of what we learned we also already knew. We is the operative term. By we, I don't mean us here, but sort of the general policy community, which is still pretty vague, but sort of the general trends in which U.S. policy is going. And what I want to refer to is, first of all, foreign policy, second of all, the economy, and then third of all, terrorism. And each one I'll talk about far too briefly, but I think that's the general points. I wanted to start with a famous quote, which is when Henry Kissinger went to China to negotiate Nixon's visit, and he met with Zhou Enlai, and he supposedly asked in the conversation to Zhou Enlai, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And the answer was, "It's too soon to tell." Now that obviously applies to 9/11. 10 years is far too soon to tell. But I've since learned that that was a misquotation. That apparently Zhou Enlai thought that Kissinger was asking about the student revolts in Paris in 1968, not the French Revolution. That came from a translator who was present at the meeting, and it came earlier when Kissinger's book on China was released, which was a year ago? Is it that long? Something like that. Anyway, there was a government translator who was present at the meeting with Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in 1971, who came to the book party and said, no, that's not, Zhou Enlai misinterpreted Kissinger's question. Thought he was referring to the students in Paris in 1968. So yes, obviously that was too soon to tell, but I think it's still a good quote. So I'll continue to use it with a footnote. I want to start with foreign policy and an interesting set of bookends, which is largely coincidence. Some of you may know the famous Marine Corps hymn, which is what it's called, which starts with the phrase, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." Now that was written in the 19th century, and Tripoli then referred to Thomas Jefferson in 1805, sending the Navy and Marines to what is now Libya to defeat the Barbary pirates. And of course we all know that a few months ago, President Obama sent U.S. air power to where? To Tripoli to defeat the Gaddafi government. As I say, it's obviously a coincidence. We could use any other example of U.S. intervention, but it's an interesting coincidence because what it does is take us back to the early days of the Republic when foreign intervention, the use of military force for foreign policy ends, and the notion of some version of regime change is hardly new. And what we saw after 9/11, while people said, oh, 9/11 means everything has changed, and I think the reality is that a lot didn't change. And in fact, if you go back through the history of U.S. foreign policy, certainly if you look at the 20th century, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, we go back to Teddy, but Franklin Roosevelt, every president since has used U.S. military and or U.S. intelligence capability with the objective being regime change. That is, changing the nature of a foreign government, changing the leadership of a foreign government. And in most of the cases, a rationale that was given was to spread democracy. And whether this is in Central America in the 1930s, whether it was in Guatemala and Iran in the 1950s, whether it was Chile in the 1970s, whether it was Dominican Republic under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, on and on and on, you see example after example of U.S. being fairly explicit about A, regime change, and B, about a rationale being the spread of democracy. And that would be in U.S. interest to spread of democracy. So what the U.S. did in Iraq really fits into this longer-term pattern. And even the rationale of weapons of mass destruction, we shouldn't forget about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, clearly that was also an attempt to deal with a regime that was seeking, in the case of Cuba in '62, it was obviously in contact with the Soviet Union, but there was still a rationale of stopping the spread and the threat from, quote, weapons of mass destruction. Question, I think, is not the question of whether something is new, but I think a bigger question is why the same types of approaches keep getting used again and again and again, even though they frequently don't work. For example, take Iraq, where we invaded with a full military force, and then that military force came up against whatever you want to call it, insurgents, terrorists, whatever name fits, and the military force couldn't handle that. Well, most of the commanders in the military in Iraq were in long enough to either have fought in or have experienced, in some sense, Vietnam. And what was Vietnam? We sent in a huge military force and came up against, quote, insurgent tactics. So did we not learn something from that previous? Well, some of you may remember that before General Petraeus went to Iraq to institute the surge, he spent a year at Fort Leavenworth rewriting the Army's counterinsurgency manual. And the implication was that most of the people who were forming policy towards Iraq really hadn't spent much time looking at previous experience with counterinsurgency. So were we reinventing the wheel or taking the wheel and just tweaking it again and again? And we can go back and find plenty of other examples. So I think the question is, what have we learned since 9/11 is why haven't we learned more? And then the other question is, on the why, we can look at a list of possible reasons. One is it a failure of the academic community to not emphasize some of those lessons and to not see where things start getting repeated? You might remember that Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, although there were plenty of dissenters, there were plenty of people who, in retrospect, should have known better, who were really heavily on board. Some of them have been writing lately about their second thoughts. I don't know how many people actually read all that was written around 9/11 2 weeks ago. I read as much as I could deal with, but you might have read Bill Keller, who was no longer managing editor of the Times, he just recently left, but now he's become a columnist. And he wrote a piece in the Times Magazine about a mea culpa, about how wrong he was about supporting Iraq. And a number of other people have done the same thing. So in effect, the people who could have stepped back and provided some perspective, many of them simply didn't do it. A second possibility is that it's a failure of the political system, which rewards rhetoric and responds to fear-mongering. And certainly after 9/11, we saw a whole lot of that. All of this stuff about, the first time we've been attacked on our soil since 1812. Pearl Harbor doesn't count because Hawaii was not a state in 1941. And all this stuff about attacking the French, Freedom Fries, or this one liquor store owner in New Brunswick opened up all his French wine and dumped it into the river. God, I felt like sending him.
Fish were happy.
Please send it here. Even cheap French wine sent here. I mean, there's all that madness, and obviously people get caught up in almost a hysterical response. Yet, obviously, the political leaders felt that was part of what they were after. And then the other question, of course, is it the power of specific interests? And then I'm looking to remind people of the line in Alan Greenspan's memoirs, where he said something to the effect of, I wish government could be more honest with people. Everybody knows that the Iraq War was about oil. That's Alan Greenspan saying. But on the other hand, he says things on both sides of issues, quite frankly. So still, it was quite intriguing. So in terms of foreign policy, well, obviously, this is a broad brush approach, and there's some specifics that would need to be looked at. But if we look back 10 years, it looks to me like not a whole lot has been changed. And obviously, we're seeing now the Obama administration has really kind of not changed things as much as many people had hoped they would, and in many respects continued a lot. For example, Guantanamo is still open. And the legal framework that was established around 9/11 really hasn't changed. So we have what people call an unprecedented amount of violation of what we thought were basic principles, such as privacy, such as not letting the intelligence apparatus operate domestically, and it's obvious that they are. A lot of things that were part of what we accepted have been shifted. On the other hand, we also have to go back to the period after World War I, when the famous Palmer raids, the Attorney General arrested people right and left who they thought were communists, and then of course after World War II, McCarthyism, which McCarthy was really just sort of a figurehead with really Nixon and some others who were pushing the same thing, silence dissent. So again, what Bush did, while different, partly because the technology is different, still there's antecedents that follow through. All right, then what about the economy? Many people have argued that the wars have been a major cause of the economic difficulties that we're in now. And one rather powerful piece of evidence not only is the size of the spending on particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, although a full accounting would probably include a whole lot more, because a lot of the changes since 9/11 don't even show up in the defense budget. They're more like in Homeland Security. So the increase post 9/11 is probably even larger than what you see in the defense budget. And Bill will probably do a little bit more on that. The first issue is that it was huge, and the second issue is that it was unfunded. This is the first time since the founding of the American Republic that a major war has been fought without any increase in taxes, and in fact, with reductions in tax rates. Now, there's one other example where a war was funded without raising taxes. No, Vietnam. Later. But in Korea, that's what Truman just totally got wiped out, because he raised taxes fully to fund the war. And you got people really furious. But every other war, there's been some combination of tax increases and borrowing. The only other example, I'm talking about major wars, I'm not talking about, little things. The only other time in what we would call American history was the Revolutionary War, but that really doesn't count. First of all, it was before the Republic, and second of all, there was no central government, so they couldn't raise taxes. Right? That was funded largely by borrowing from Europe, primarily from France. Right? So our friends back then became
Our friends.
Well, history has a funny way. Well, now, of course, in Libya, they're our friends again.
Yeah, but look at what state the country's in. I mean, I blame the
for giving us the country in the 1770s.
For trusting us with democracy.
Well, they gave us Lafayette and they gave us money.
And Haiti.
What?
And Haiti.
And Haiti, right. And then later they sold us.
Yeah, I was going to say Louisiana Purchase more than Haiti.
They sold us half the country.
Good and bad.
For a song.
But then the issue goes back to an old debate. To what extent does military spending have a negative effect on our economy? My own view here is that the sources of the present situation, I'm referring to the financial crash starting in 2007, and the continuation of what some people are calling the Great Recession, and now Brad DeLong at UC Berkeley is starting to call it the Little Depression. And if things go the way they are now, it may drop a little, and it may be looking more and more like a real depression. I think the sources and the roots of this really predate 9/11. I think there are two main ones, and there are plenty of others. One, of course, is the major changes in the financial system, which involve a steady amount of deregulation, again, well predating 9/11, and the growth of a huge financial sector which was never regulated. So it's not like they were deregulated, they just weren't regulated. What's sometimes called the shadow banking system. But a huge number of institutions and a huge quantity of funds that flow through them, which are established outside of even the regulatory system that was set up in the 1930s. And that's a time bomb. I mean, there's a huge amount of historical research. The recent book by Rogoff and what's her name? Reinhardt? Yeah. It goes back through several hundred years worth of data to show about how financial crises continually occur in large part when the financial sector escapes regulation and goes into, and nothing stops them from getting involved in speculation. But you didn't have to read that book. You could go back to Charles Kindleberger, who wrote about this decades ago, or you could go back to the 19th century and Edward Macaulay, who in the early 19th century wrote a description of a series of bubbles. The South Sea bubble, the tulip bubble in Holland, and on and on. We had the land bubble in Mississippi in the 19th century. The notion that the modern economy was immune from this is so absolutely and totally crazy that, again, it's mind-boggling that people actually thought that way. And of course now we're getting to the point where people are now thinking that way again, because there's real serious pushback against the extension of regulations. And the big banks are now arguing that they are being penalized by being now asked to hold excessive capital, right? And Jamie Dimon, who's head of
And it is excessive because we'll have to bail them out again.
That's right.
So it must be excessive.
No, it's excessive if they don't do it. But Jamie Dimon, who was considered to be the liberal, right? He's the head of right now head of Morgan. He's had a career in the financial sector, starting when he was a mere child in his 30s, and he was considered the boy wonder. And he's been giving quotes saying it's un-American. Since when is capital requirements of banks a patriotic issue? For God's sakes, you're getting this kind of rhetoric continuing. The other issue, I think, is the growth of severe inequality, which really is dated empirically from the early 1970s. In other words, 30 years before 9/11. And what inequality does, and we're seeing it now in the extreme in terms of the huge increases in income at the very, very top of the income distribution, like the top 1/10 of 1%. You've probably all seen stories. One of the big growth industries are luxury yachts. Why are there so many luxury yachts being built? Because the fastest growing segment of the wealth distribution is billionaires. We got 16% real unemployment here, and it's billionaires who are prospering and buying luxury yachts. And I don't think, as the stock market goes down, I'm sure that companies like Daimler-Benz are not suffering, and other luxury goods suppliers are doing quite well. But the other thing that income inequality growing produces is a market for and demand for debt. In other words, people in their attempts to maintain living standards or attempts to achieve the higher living standards they expected are much more likely to get into severe debt problems than they were previously. I mean, the subprime mortgage issue is to me a way of bringing these people in with unrealistic promises and literally fake instruments. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of criminality that has not been touched so far. Some of it may continue to be, where mortgages and mortgage securities were sold with the sellers knowing exactly what was in them and knowing that they were going to fail. And in fact, there are instances where they bet against, in the markets, they bet against the mortgages that they themselves were issuing. So they really had a sense that this was all garbage, and at some point it would fail, and by betting against them in the markets, they were going to make money, and then the government would step in and bail them out. So they were going to be fine no matter what happened. So the extension of deregulation and the growing inequality, I think, are the two main long-term sources. Now, did the rise in the military budget post 9/11, did that have something to do with it? Sure. But the argument, some of you may know that Joe Stiglitz has been writing about this for a number of years now, including an op-ed in the, I think, LA Times. I think it was the weekend of 9/11 or maybe more recently. And the argument that he makes, and his colleague Linda Bilmes, they had a book out in 08, and I think they're doing a revised version. They estimated the costs of the war on terror at about $3 trillion. Excuse me. Billions are nothing anymore.
You can't buy lunch for $3
Can't buy lunch for $3, especially if you're in the military commissary in Iraq. $3 trillion. And they're raising that estimate now to probably closer to 4. One of the reasons being the long-term costs of health care for veterans, which is estimated now at close to $900 billion, and won't peak probably for at least 20 or 30 years when the veterans of Iraq become middle-aged and older. When they get into normal kinds of health problems, but now they're going to have even more severe because of the after effects of their combat. And what Stiglitz and Bilmes talk about, and many others do, is, gee, what could we have done with this money if we hadn't spent it over there? And I have problems with that, because you really need to have what historians call a solid counterfactual, and we don't have that. It's not obvious that the money spent in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been spent somewhere that was more productive. For all we know, it would have been spent in some other military venture, or it would have been more tax cuts to the rich. We really don't know. And you need to have a very, very solid counterfactual argument. And that argument probably has to start with 9/11. I mean, there is another starting point. We could have said, well, suppose that on January 20th, 2001, instead of George Bush being inaugurated, Al Gore was inaugurated, right? I mean, he probably really did win, but that's another story. But suppose the Supreme Court had been 5-4 the other direction, and Gore had been nominated. What would have been different? And I think that 9/11 would have still happened. Assuming that Al-Qaeda would have just continued on the same path. And then the question is, what would Gore have done? Would he have invaded Afghanistan? And my reaction is, yes, he would. Would he have invaded Iraq? Probably not, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't have done something else. Right? They might have chased Al-Qaeda other places. Or they might have poured a whole lot more into Afghanistan. We could have ended up with a military budget increase of roughly the same amount, in which case the economic impacts would not have been a whole lot different. That's just one alternative scenario. All right, let me go to the last one. I want to make sure I don't take up all of those.
Go for it.
Go for it. The third issue is, what have we learned about terrorism? answer is we've learned a lot, but most of it we already knew. A lot of the research on terrorism after 9/11 was reinventing the wheel. And my favorite example is
Don't say Terronomics.
no,
Okay.
that's a book that we put out, which was not reinventing the wheel. We had some really, really good stuff.
There you go.
Was an argument about whether terrorism results from poverty. And there was an article that was written by Alan Kruger from Princeton, who has just been appointed to chair the Council of Economic Advisors. He needs to go through Senate confirmation, but I'm sure he'll get it because he's already been confirmed for 2 previous positions in government. And he's a really solid and very good economist, et cetera. But he wrote a piece that was a critique of the hypothesis that poverty causes terrorism. And the hypothesis was created by quotes from a whole range of people, none of whom were researchers on terrorism. Almost all of them were politicians, starting with George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Al Gore, and a number of other people who had political positions about how poverty is a source of people getting involved in terrorist activity. What they ignored, for example, they quoted a speech from Bush, and they ignored a speech which he gave a week before where he explicitly said, poverty does not make you a murderer. In other words, poverty itself is not a... But they went on and they accumulated data, and other people wrote articles, and it went on for 4 or 5 years with articles, etc. And the reality is that that issue had been discussed and investigated over decades. The broad issue of whether poverty or other forms of economic deprivation are direct causes of political violence. There was a book written by a guy named Ted Gurr, G-U-R-R, a political scientist, it was written in 1970, and it's called Why Men Rebel. And he explicitly rejected, and it was empirical, he explicitly rejected the argument that extreme poverty is a cause of violent rebellion. And there were others who had written there. So that's one example, and I think there are many others. Now, what we did learn, and this goes against what was the common view, or maybe relearn. For example, you can't have a war on terror. Why? Well, terror isn't a country. Terror isn't a political movement. Terror is not an ideology. Terror is a tactic. It's something that people choose to do to gain advantage in a violent conflict. So terror is like air power. Terror is like, the horse cavalry in the 19th century. You use it in certain situations because you make a cost-benefit calculation that you gain from it more than you lose. And that calculation isn't always successful. Remember the charge of the Light Brigade? Cannon to the left, cannon to the right. Whoever authorized the charge of the Light Brigade probably got sacked. Killed. Well, I said authorized, not led. The point is that raising terror to that point of we have a war on it, that's a recipe for a war that never ends. Because terror is sort of like crime. I don't think anyone seriously expects terror to go away, just like we don't seriously expect crime to go away. The other thing, two other points I want to make is that there was also a tendency to use psychological explanations. Some of you remember Bush using phrases like, they hate us, they hate our way of life. Nonsense. They couldn't care less what we do with ourselves. What they cared about is, why are we doing it to them? We can have whatever way of life we want. Just don't force it on them. That's what their view was. And studies of people who are actively engaged in terrorist activity, those who didn't kill themselves, but there are plenty of examples of suicide bombers who were caught. Studies by psychologists, like in Israel, concluded that these folks are just about as normal as everybody else. Their motives are not something, they don't have screws loose. Right? they're driven to this by social, political, and some economic motivation. And the other thing, and this has come out more lately, but I've seen research on it before, terrorism usually fails. If the objective of terrorism is to change how governments operate, it usually fails. There are some examples where it succeeds partially, but there are very, very few examples where it changes a political dynamic. It may raise some costs, it may stretch out a timeline, but those examples where terror tactics appear to succeed are probably examples where the change would have occurred anyway, such as some of the anti-colonial activities in Africa. I'm thinking of the Kenyan rebellion, the Mau Maus, where they used tactics we today would call terror. Well, the British were going to pull out at some point anyway. And they weren't going to stay because they couldn't afford to. Right? So historically, you'd have to argue that, yeah, it probably might have speeded things up, but it would have happened anyway without that tactic. So my overall conclusion, what have we learned since 9/11? I'd give the learning about a C, and that's generous. Anyway.
Just make one quick comment. So I think that briefly on the war on terror, I think there are two problems with it. There's the construction war on, which almost always signifies something that's going to fail. If you say war on cancer, war on poverty, war on crime, war on drugs, and you go on and on, none of those I think could be widely thought of as successful. So there's something wrong with declaring war on these things. So and the terror, I agree. Tactic.
Well, part of it is that phrase is highly political in the sense that it's designed to get popular support for a certain activity. But you're right. I mean, every time that this country has declared a war on something, that something's still here. In some cases, like you saw this poverty statistics released a few weeks ago. We have the highest rates of poverty now than we've had since what, the 1920s.
Yeah.
So
I thought there was a part two.
No, that's fine. I'll save it for later.
You're the
So,
chair.
I'm
So
the
you
chair.
can recognize or not recognize Lee.
Lee, do you want to jump in now, or should
Well,
you
I just,
yourself?
I'd like to pose a question for later, which is, David, would we react to a terrorist attack now the same way we did to 9/11, with as much hysteria, with as much? I mean, because the burden of what you're saying is we didn't learn anything, and therefore we do the same thing.
I think we do something similar. We would probably do it quicker. We now have different tools. Granted, I didn't say everything was, but a lot of what we've learned militarily, my argument is we probably should have already known it from past experience. I'm being overly general, right? I myself don't have direct experience with how the military thinks about these things or how they operate. But certainly we have things like, more accurate short-range missiles, we have the drones, we have better intelligence from satellites, we have all kinds of stuff that we have better. But the overall sense that we have responded with some kind of military retaliation, yes, I think we would. It may depend on where this other attack emanates from. I mean, Afghanistan is a relatively easy target because basically the government there with that was the Taliban. If it came from, say, Saudi Arabia, that might be a different story of how we did it. But I think we would do something like that.
Okay, Bill, please.
Well, my presentation is narrower, more focused on the last 10 years. I agreed to give a talk like this at the University of Maryland, which I gave a week or two ago, and on the militarization of U.S. foreign policy since 9/11. And when I agreed to do it, I was like, well, yeah, of course I know what this. And then I started thinking about it, what do I really mean by that? And it was a harder proposition than I expected, particularly in light of how different is it these last 10 years than what's come prior. But the first thing that came to mind was Iraq, and a lot of this is probably old ground for people here to go over. But I was interested in the discussions on the 10th anniversary that Iraq was not discussed at all. The whole debacle in Iraq was not really very much on the table for discussion. And I think the reason I see that as kind of the long term is a couple of reasons. One, it was the first kind of big boots on the ground operation, probably since Vietnam. And also the argumentation that led up to it. Was sort of a test run for some of the arguments of the Dick Cheneys and Paul Wolfowitzes of the world, who had already said, prior to September 11th and during the Clinton years that we needed a Reaganite foreign policy of peace through strength. We should take out Saddam Hussein. Essentially, instead of having a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, we should go for it. Because we're an unchallenged power now. We can remake the world in some ways using our military power. And the shifting rationales and the fact that they carried the day, I thought was an unfortunate chapter in our history. The two big public arguments, Iraq had links to Al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, were already subject to serious question before the war started. And yet, we continue. Bush himself, on the eve of the war, sort of put the two together in his address to the nation. He said, secretly and without fingerprints, he, Saddam Hussein, could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own. The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological, or one-day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country. So it was a straight-on fear campaign. And, needless to say, later looks at this subject by the 9/11 Commission, by the Senate Intelligence Committee, found that there were no operational links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. In fact, Daniel Benjamin, who wrote an essay about this some months prior to the war, pointed out that Iraq and Al-Qaeda are not obvious allies, they're natural enemies, given their ideological differences, the secular regime versus the extreme fundamentalist movement. And the question also being, are you going to share a weapon of mass destruction with a group that you can't control, what they would do with that weapon? So despite the weak evidence, that notion had strong public traction. And then as for the weapons of mass destruction, or what Condoleezza Rice called the smoking gun that could become a mushroom cloud, there were already dissenters in the intelligence community, well prior to the war. Of course, they didn't get a lot of play. I mean, you could find the articles about it, but it wasn't front and center. The UN inspectors had gotten to the point where they said, we can't prove for sure that it doesn't have anything, but they didn't find anything as of the time that the war started. And the notion of letting them finish their job was not something that the Bush administration would sit still for. After the war, the Bush administration put its own survey together, the Iraq Survey Group, also known as the Dulfer Commission, which found that not only did Iraq not have weapons of mass destruction, but they didn't have active programs for building them at the time that the war started. And Jay Rockefeller, the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, said, the administration would like the American public to believe that Saddam's intention to build a weapons program, regardless of actual weapons or the capability to produce weapons, justified invading Iraq. In fact, we invaded a country, 1,000 people have died, and Iraq never posed a grave or growing danger. Of course, other rationales were put forward. Oil was even mentioned at certain points, but certainly not the lead argument. Probably the biggest kind of subsidiary argument was that getting rid of Saddam Hussein would open the door to a democratic Iraq and a flowering democracy throughout the Middle East. The kind of a related argument was the kind of Richard Pearl reverse domino effect. If you're sitting in Syria, or you're sitting in Libya, or you're sitting in another country, once you see what we've done to Saddam Hussein, you're going to do what we want, or else you're next. That was kind of one of the other ways that it was spun. But no matter what the argument was, was it weapons of mass destruction? Was it Al Qaeda? Was it humanitarian intervention against a thug or dictator? The answer seemed to come back the same, which was military action was the solution. And it kind of blended into Bush's argument about preventive war, his national security strategy, where basically, and here's a short quote from it, the United States has long maintained the option of preemptive actions to counter a sufficient threat to our national security. The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction, and the more compelling the case for taking anticipatory action to defend ourselves, even if uncertainty remains as to the time and place of the enemy's attack. To forestall or prevent such hostile acts by our adversaries, the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively. And then in the preface, Bush says, just makes common sense to act against emerging threats before they're fully formed, or to be prepared to act against our enemy's plans, using the best intelligence and acting with deliberation. So there's a couple issues. One is, how advanced these plans have to be before you argue that it's relevant to intervene. Is he thinking about it? Is that enough? Or what exactly evidence are you using? And given that the notion of using the best intelligence, acting with deliberation, obviously was not carried out in this instance. So there was this larger, and it wasn't really, he used the word preemptive, but really it was a preventive war doctrine, because preemptive usually means there's some sort of recognizable threat that's imminent. This was more the case that, he might do something at some point. And in fact, one of the arguments that at least was rational was the argument that, we have to take him out now because we'll never assemble this kind of coalition again. So even if he's not in the midst of developing weapons of mass destruction, once he gets out from under the sanctions, he will do this at some point in the future. So that's a pretty long timeline. That's not a preemptive reaction to an immediate threat. So in that sense, I think Iraq, not only did it kind of militarize the discourse, but also obviously large amounts of resources went into the war. But as David intimated, that was only part of the post 9/11 investment in various security-related options. So there's a group coordinated by Brown University called the Eisenhower Research Project, which I'm sort of an outlier member of, and has done a website called costofwar.org, and tried to look at all the different costs of the war on terror. So there were the costs of Iraq and Afghanistan. Winslow Wheeler, who's one of the members, argued that you should look at the sort of excess Pentagon spending. What was the Pentagon's 5 and 10 year projection before 9/11? What did they end up spending? So I think that could be subject to debate, but that's the methodology that was used. Then the costs of caring for veterans, which had very long term amount as time goes on, increasing the service of the debt that was generated, the mushrooming of homeland security spending. So all these things together, Iraq and Afghanistan by themselves were about $1 trillion proposition. This would push all the related costs more into the level of about $4 trillion. And as David said, we don't know for a fact that the money would have been used better, but it's hard to imagine a worse way of having used it, given what we gained from all that investment. So the other kind of thing that grew out of Iraq was this role of the Pentagon as kind of an all-purpose agency. So it wasn't just to kill people; it was engaged in economic development. In Iraq, Rumsfeld sort of elbowed the Agency for International Development out of the way, and sort of had the Pentagon sort of coordinating the kind of Halliburton-led reconstruction efforts. They developed special Pentagon programs like the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which was basically individual commanders could make decisions about what kind of money to hand out in different villages, different areas. It was not a huge program, about $500 million a year, but it was it wasn't like a normal program that had sort of bureaucracy and approval and a process. It was really just kind of walking around And the motto of the program was "Money is a weapon." And so, in addition to the economic aspects, there was a mushrooming of various new security assistance programs. So the kind of traditional approach was you had big programs like the Foreign Military Financing Program, International Military Education and Training Program, which were authorized through the State Department, implemented by the Pentagon. And there were various laws built up over the years about human rights conditions, governments that were viewed as assisting terrorists, governments involved in proliferation of nuclear weapons, conditions on these various forms of assistance. But the new Pentagon programs were often not subject to those same conditions, and in many cases, Congress was not even aware of them. My colleague Laura Lumpy did a piece on U.S. security assistance in Central Asia since 9/11, and she found several dozen new ways in which the Pentagon was authorized to provide arms and training that were not we're not consulting the State Department. Congress, if not secret, certainly was not on top of these things. You had to sort of burrow deep into the budget to find out that they existed. So there's been this kind of, Pentagon's got a little more scope, to put it mildly, than it did before, to build these military-to-military relationships in places that might otherwise be done, at least with some conditions set up. Then you had the growth of private security contractors, and in my first kind of exposure to it was the book that Peter Singer had done, probably 8 years ago or more, where he talked about sort of the growth of the phenomenon. It was initially authorized by Dick Cheney in the Bush 1 administration, where they did a study of whether private companies could provide logistics rather than using uniformed military personnel. And they decided it would be a cost-effective way to go and a more efficient way of supporting military operations. And so the first company to get such a contract was Halliburton, which then Cheney went on to become the CEO of. And they were active in Somalia, they were active in the Balkans, but the real, what seemed like at the time to be the big ramp up was the first, between the first Gulf War and the 2003 invasion. Singer initially estimated that there were probably 10 times as many security contractors in the conflict zone as there had been in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. Later, the Pentagon, Congressional Research Service, others looked at it kind of more comprehensively. So they looked at not just the armed security people, but the people doing the laundry and doing the food supplies. And a lot of these people were not U.S. citizens. There was a whole hierarchy of production. So you had retired Marines and Special Forces carrying guns, not only from the United States, but from other countries. But then you had low-wage labor doing a lot of these other things with very modest sums of money. So that it may well be that despite all the waste, this may have been a cheaper way of sustaining a war effort than using military personnel. But I think that the breakdown is important because a lot of kind of loose talk about the use of these private contractors makes it sound like they're sort of traditional mercenaries. And I was at a conference at NYU yesterday about counterinsurgency, and one of the professors there, who was trying desperately to agree with me, and I was trying not to be agreeing with him, was saying, well, in Iraq, we're just going to leave 160,000 contractors, and it'll be just the same as it was, when we had troops there. But these contractors serve very specialized functions. I mean, the security contractors that carry guns are probably 5 or 10% of these large numbers. One estimate, as many security private contracting personnel as military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. But most of them are doing these other support functions. They're doing logistics, they're building military bases, they're providing food. And I think that can continue, but that's not, without uniformed personnel, you don't have a rule. And so in that sense, I think they're kind of enablers of war. Maybe you can stretch the same number of troops further in a sense, but they're not an alternative to an organized military force. I've talked about the contractors. Double security systems. I'm making more progress than I intended to. I'd say the other aspect of it that I'm trying to get a handle on is, I don't know if you've seen this new book, Top Secret America, Dana Priest and Bill Arkin. But they've tried to kind of untangle all the secret operations that have been enabled since 9/11. So everything from coordination between the FBI and local law enforcement and using new surveillance techniques and new criteria for who should be subject to those surveillance activities, to use of special forces to carry out secret operations and growth of the special forces, to the jockeying for position between the CIA and the other intelligence agencies for various aspects of the war on terror. And basically their conclusion is that we have created sort of an unprecedented secret apparatus for carrying out foreign policy and domestic surveillance that really is almost unregulated in terms of the Congress. And I don't know that this is one of these books that's got mountains of information. I think it still needs a little more processing to think about whether it's quite as big a disjunction as they claim. But one of the sort of conclusions that's kind of come to a few small points in the book is that it sort of revolves back to this issue of fear. That if people are afraid enough, they'll give government pretty much free rein to engage in these activities without a lot of demands for accountability, for transparency, and so forth. So I think, the sort of place we are now, I don't think there's a lot of, you're not going to find a lot of support for fighting another Iraq, another Afghanistan, war of occupation, a large-scale counterinsurgency. And so the new argument, the new terrain is going to be, what about these new ways of fighting terrorism? What about the drone attacks? Is the Libya model something to be emulated in future interventions for humanitarian purposes? Basically, forms of intervention that involve fewer boots on the ground and theoretically are less expensive. And I think some of that is to some degree, Iraq set a low bar for what we find acceptable, because it was so obvious to many of us anyway that it was not justified, and certainly the costs were not justified, that the methods were not particularly effective. And so a lot of energy went into just saying, this kind of war shouldn't happen again. But I don't think there was as much debate on what would be legitimate strategy, legitimate use of force, the best, most effective way to fight terrorism, what's the role of the military in that fight. I think has gotten less discussion than it might have, because in a sense, the Iraq debate was almost too easy, and it was kind of people that you seem to agree with in the context of the Iraq War. And once that's taken off the table, you realize that there's a wide range of opinion as to what are the most important threats going forward, how the military should be organized to deal with them. So I think I don't think we're in the same place in that sense. I think there's sort of an opening now because of the reaction to the wars, because the Pentagon's not going to have a blank check in the way it's had in the last 10 years. It's going to force some choices as to what the strategy is, what the purposes and focus of the military is. With the caveat that there's sort of the rational argument of what is your military for, what's your strategy, and then there's the domestic debate, which doesn't always follow the same rules. So I think, for example, when they argue for the big budgets, they have to argue for things like China as a future rival. I think they still have to argue that we might fight a large-scale counterinsurgency as in Afghanistan. Because otherwise, if your threats are cyber war, and you can use counterterrorism as a strategy to do things like get Osama bin Laden, at a certain point you run out of rationale for some of these big weapon systems for the levels of troops that we have now. And so I think some of these concepts that may not actually be ever carried out are still going to be part of the debate about what to spend on the military and what shape it should take. So that is my much narrower, less historically sweeping contribution. Yeah.
Lee, please.
Now I really do want to make the counter argument very brief. Because David tells us, gee, they used these arguments but we all know they were just arguments and they manipulated the situation. But they had an interest in doing it. And you say, well, we won't do that again because large-scale wars. So let me take the counter to both those positions and say, when the United States of America gets hit by a large-scale terrorist act, we're going to do the same goddamn thing again, which is we're going to show muscle, because terrorist attack on the U.S. means weakness, and we've got to punish somebody. And it doesn't matter whether that somebody had nothing to do with the terrorism. We're going to whack them in better Iraq than Afghanistan, because at least we know where it is. Whereas the guys in Afghanistan, as we know, we may believe they weren't in cities of Pakistan.
But are we going to do it in the same way, I guess?
Yes, I think in the same way. Because the military still likes to do it in the same way. Despite all the talk about counterterrorism, I am persuaded that the Army has not taken it fully on and will still try to preserve large forces. The Air Force, of course, doesn't particularly like drones, but they'll have to live with it because they can't afford enough pilots, but they'll do a mix of pilots and drones. And the Navy still has ships. They got to use the ships. So we will still do it the same way. Okay?
That's the counter.
Well, presumably, though.
Oh, everyone. No, go ahead.
No, that's right.
Just in terms of resources, I mean, some of them's going to have to give. I mean, they're not going to be able to spend.
We'll borrow.
Definitely. So you're thinking we'll keep spending at this level.
Let me just suggest
the Martin Feldstein argument. You didn't do enough stimulus, and you did it the wrong way. You should not worry about rebuilding bridges because there aren't enough shovel-ready projects. You should have spent it on the military because then there would have been public support for it.
Well,
that's the Feldstein argument.
Right.
And he wanted twice the expenditure.
Yeah. I mean, there's another reason that we use the military, right? It was because Cheney preferred to not use the intelligence community, didn't trust the intelligence community, didn't want to. So, I mean, another argument might be not that we'll go military again, but that we'll use the intelligence community. Drones are run by the CIA; they're not run by the Air Force, for example. You have a pretty substantial, special force, very hot. So, I mean, it could be that this time around, if there is this time, we would see the intelligence community used.
The intelligence community doesn't show muscle.
It does now.
It's hidden.
It's hidden, but
That's
the drone program.
Show muscle.
Okay, so you're talking on the
for
political
domestic
level.
consumption.
Well, very pleased.
I like your argument, except I think it's over.
Good.
For two reasons. One, if there's another terrorist attack, then it's proof that the strategy show muscle didn't work. I mean, if we go back next, that's number one. Number two, I think the military like to have a lot of toys and a lot of people. They don't necessarily want to use them, I think.
I couldn't agree more. But
okay, and three, I think the political situation in this country is such that if this were to happen within the next few years, you would have to deal with the Tea Party and the Democrats fear of debt and deficits, and they, say, no, it didn't work. It doesn't work, and we have to.
I don't think you're taking this on a deep enough level. I really don't. Look, we're weak in two respects. We got hit by a bunch of clowns, and they took two big buildings down and killed a lot of Americans. But two, we're weak because we're economically weak. So we have to show strength, okay? And have to show strength means we're going to show the Chinese who's tough. We're going to whack somebody, not them. That's too dangerous. And it's not an argument of the military. The military didn't argue for any of these things. Okay? The politicians did. The military didn't want to do it. They didn't want to do Afghanistan, and they didn't want to do Iraq. Okay? All right? This is an argument about Americans, not about a government of Dick Cheney's who wants to get us into trouble. It's how will Americans react if we're whacked again? And what do politicians think Americans will want? Will they want to show muscle? Or will they, like the British guy who ran the Northern Ireland covert thing said, or will we eventually wake up and be adult enough to tolerate getting whacked? Because we're gonna sooner or later get whacked. Not 3,000 of us, but we're gonna get whacked. Okay, 20 years from now, 15 years from now, long enough time horizon. Will Americans sit still for it, and will politicians think they will, or will we do the same thing?
Okay, I basically agree with what you're saying, but I think one issue is the source of the attack. In other words, when Al-Qaeda attacked, where were they? They were in Afghanistan. What?
They were in Pakistan.
Yeah, but they were being
in Afghanistan. They were in Pakistan.
But they were under the protection of a government in Afghanistan. And in fact,
government in Pakistan. Sorry, but the reality.
You're missing my point.
Yeah.
The people we were going to whack were trivial. So whacking
Iraq have to do it?
What?
That's why I say we did Iraq, because the other thing was too trivial. To show muscle, you had to do something bigger.
But suppose that the attack emanates from someplace else. Maybe Yemen.
Idaho.
What?
Idaho.
Idaho.
I'm not.
Now you're talking about
I'm serious.
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, but also keep in mind that in fact the attention to Iraq was not because the people in Afghanistan were trivial. It's because that's where the administration wanted to go from day one, before 9/11. Okay? And in fact, the evidence suggests that if they had put the resources into Afghanistan that they were shifting to Iraq, then they wouldn't have had to wait 10 years to get bin Laden.
You're still dealing with this as a rational policy.
No, I'm
as
talking.
A good economist would, and I'm saying we needed to whack somebody.
Yes.
If you listen to what the guys like Cheney, we know some of the internal debates. They were talking about showing muscle.
So, in your argument, would Al Gore have done the same then?
Pardon?
Would Al Gore have done the same? The counterfactual.
I think he would have.
The same pressure
to do it.
Yes.
Whack someone, whack Saddam.
Whether it would have been Iraq or something else, I think first of all, you could hear the Republicans screaming, because they were already been screaming. We were, a weak, under muscled giant, not showing the world.
I understand what you're saying, but in fact, I think, as I said, the Iraq thing was on the table well before 9/11. It was on the table from the time Bush was elected.
Clinton years.
What?
From the Clinton years.
Well, it was on the table from Bush 1. All right? At least, if not before. Well, before we supported Iraq against Iran. But you're missing my point.
Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be some degree of legitimacy to the whacking. In other words, you can't just pick out someone you don't like.
Like Iraq?
But they created it. But they created it. They created it over a year and a half.
Okay, let
You
me
can't
let me
do
suggest-
that.
Okay, let me give you a counterfactual, a hypothetical. All right. Okay, the attack doesn't come from Afghanistan/Pakistan, but it comes from Malaysia. So whom do we whack? North Korea.
That's, I think, a stretch.
Hey, North Korea has as much to do with Malaysia as Iraq had to do with Pakistan. I mean, you know, I'm sorry.
I agree.
Again, if the issue is muscle,
Yeah.
we are not talking about a rational response. We're talking about we have to whack somebody.
The difference is that North Korea has a neighbor that we don't want to get annoyed at us.
Maybe.
Maybe. Well, all right, that's a possibility, but that's a different neighborhood than Iraq. A very different neighborhood. They have two neighbors that we don't want to get annoyed with. I mean, they're pretty close to Russia as well as to China. So that's a different story. You can't just whack them.
No, but okay, but
They feel like
Maybe somebody in New Jersey.
But the question is, so if I hear you right, I just want to make sure I understand what this conversation is about. If I hear you right, you basically do accept the premise that at this point, Americans do want to whack somebody. And yes, some rationality does come into it in terms of you wouldn't want to do North Korea because
I
it's
don't
risky.
disagree.
Okay,
It's
so
like,
look,
If
but that does change some of the dynamics of this if you accept that premise.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm just arguing a devil's advocate.
keep
I'm
in
not saying
mind-
I want to do this. I'm just saying, will we?
Keep in mind what I was saying, that we don't learn lessons from the past.
Yes, I
And we
agree.
keep repeating a lot of the same things.
But one lesson we do learn, which is Americans like to show power when they feel weak,
Yes.
and that's a pretty scary lesson.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
And it's very deep rooted.
And it's
if
even-
true. If true.
And
Again,
it's even
a
scarier.
hypothesis, it's not a truth.
It's even scarier if you watch the Republican debates.
Thank you.
I mean,
And the Democratic nervousness.
when Mitt Romney becomes the safe candidate, you know we're in trouble. I mean, look at the rest of them.
They're going to attack Mexico. They're going to attack.
The first, you weren't here when
I'm sorry, Ryan.
the first phrase of the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
Perfect.
Look, we got an excuse for attacking Mexico. The drug wars.
Reagan.
I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Reagan had it right.
Is that?
What was the name of the island? He can't even remember.
Grenada.
Right?
Oh, Grenada.
That's what you were trying to show us. So done.
Yeah. Well, and we
Or Gaddafi, for that matter. We
and
also-
Panama.
Yeah.
We invaded Panama to put the.
No, that was Bush.
I know.
Reagan.
We need.
Reagan had,
Yeah.
really perfect.
Well, we invaded. Talk about regime change. We invaded Panama to put the head of state in jail. He's still there. He's chairing. He's chairing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got a chair. You
Yeah,
can't. You can't.
Rudolph, and then I have a comment myself. Rudolph.
No, you're not allowed.
It's prerogative of the
Well,
chair.
That's right. I already made my comment.
We don't use that
Korea,
much.
just as an aside, you got the other problem that you mentioned that Seoul will probably be devastated in any war.
Yeah.
So I think
They're all Koreans.
might be a well, not really, right?
Iraq was
Still,
devastated in New Orleans.
Iraq couldn't really do any major damage in the war than anyone else. And North Korea is in a position where it could, and we couldn't take them out without hitting artillery with nuclear weapons, which would also devastate Seoul. So,
You're treating this ration, and I'm saying,
you know, look, lots of people do irrational things. I agree with you on that. In terms of the Iraq War, I was one of those who mistakenly advocated it. My mistakes were that I didn't realize how incompetent the military would be in the follow-up, and I didn't realize how bad the internal divisions would be in tactics that would be used. But my rationale was totally different than what the administration used, even though at the time I thought they might have been thinking that, even though that wasn't a public stance, but there's no evidence that they did. And that was, what was the situation you were in, what was Al-Qaeda trying to do, among other things. One of the rationales of Al-Qaeda was that we were a weak type. We had been thrown out of a whole number of places. Somalia, we hadn't been successful in the first Iraq War because we didn't pursue it, etc., etc. So, one of the arguments would be to override this if Iraq had been successful. Would be a counterexample to show that we were not quite a neat tiger. Of course, it turned out to be the opposite, which was disastrous. The argument that you really faced at that time, besides hitting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, was what were the main sources of real concern? They were Saudi Arabia, because this has to be viewed as part of, and this is the thing that I think is so awfully neglected. The Hudson Institute does a good job of this, but on the whole, people ignore the religious component of this. And it's related to the cultural component of the Arab world and their history. And you really had two basic strands. You had the Wahhabi strand combined with some of the additions, who were basically the Muslim Brotherhood, who had felt that this was sort of a long-term objective, nothing that had to be done immediately. And then you had this extreme faction, Al-Qaeda, that wanted to advocate militant means right away to achieve it quickly. And they, of course, diverged, and there were strong divisions here. But the underlying source of all of this, of all the funding for the radicalism, was coming from Saudi Arabia. It would have been a logical place to attack, except for the fact that we got petroleum there. It would have been really unthinkable for a whole number of reasons. The other area of concern that we had to have was Pakistan, where Al-Qaeda had moved, and which had cooperated with the Taliban, and had some strong influence in the military that had been put in on the Iraq. And then, of course, the concern that if, by some means, even though it didn't seem likely, some of these extreme elements ever got hold of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, we would have that threat we were concerned about. But Pakistan is too large a country to invade. It wasn't quite logical. Now here you had Iraq, which the sanctions were weakening. We had that concern, which was mistaken, about possible weapons. And consequently, if you could successfully hit Iraq, where would you be? You would be in a position where in Afghanistan and Iraq, we'd be surrounding Iran, which was already an emerging threat. You would be in a position to pressure the Saudis to change their policy, which they did, but not for a whole number of reasons, but that was one. And you might have had some success in changing overall opinion. But of course, it failed for the reasons I indicated, and therefore, this risky policy turned out to be a disaster. Now, another thing to look at is the question of how do we look at this from the point of view of Al-Qaeda. The obvious conclusion is that they had failed. They're no longer as popular in the Muslim world as they had been. You have more of a movement towards the Arab Spring, which is viewed as not quite as radical. And you have a situation in which, of course, Al-Qaeda itself has been tremendously weakened. But on the other, and of course, one of the main things that Al-Qaeda was looking for was that the masses in the Arab world would attack their rulers, which didn't happen. Not in the way that they were anticipating at the time. It happened in a different way for different reasons, but not because of quite what happened there. But the other thing was, this is not, may have been what Al-Qaeda's strategy was. I don't know what their internal thinking was in that regard, but if I had been in that position, and I was trying to face a power like the U.S., what would be the only thing that I would see would work? It would be to draw the U.S. into many countries and weaken it by dispersing its military areas which it would fail in. It would disperse its power and thereby weaken itself. If you can get them to attack many countries that they wouldn't be successful in, you might have a success. Well, this is, in effect, partly what happened. We've drawn ourselves and weakened ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't have the sort of population attitude we had in World War II, where you were willing to have tremendous sacrifice. In this period, adorant Russia has become ascendant thanks to the prices of energy increasing and the fact that we were ignoring things. And we now have a situation we find ourselves in which we really don't have the stomach for a lot of things unless you have some sort of other terrorist attack of that magnitude that we had on 9/11, where you have a horrible situation in the whole Middle East and the wider Muslim world. Pakistan is more in a state of turmoil. You know, the thing that we look at when we see extreme movements is that a very small minority typically in the countries that they took over. But if you get sufficient turmoil and you have an organized, hard group like the Bolsheviks in Russia, they can sometimes take command of the situation. If that were ever to happen in Pakistan with their nuclear weapons, we'd have a problem. You have a situation in regard to Israel, where Egypt, the popular sentiment is somewhat anti-Israeli. The military government, and one of the other mistakes in the general press, of course, is Tunisia and Egypt did not have a change in government. They just threw out the rulers, but the army was still dominant in both.
Let's let him respond.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, if I hear you right, it sounds like you're suggesting the possibility that Al-Qaeda wanted us to invade Iraq.
Yes, I think they certainly, they might not have been thinking it was invading Iraq,
But
it's
that
a general idea.
But it's an interesting hypothesis, but the connections would have to be very, very distant. I mean, they may have wanted it, but what influence would they have in Washington to bring it about?
Well, I think
The exact influence that suggested our desire to strike out.
But to strike out at Iraq?
Well, I don't think they anticipated that.
Or just the Arab world in general.
Just
I
Arab
think
world in
that's
general.
it's the president's problem. It's that we be out there in greater force, not that we can attack all these places.
Right. So, please.
I have a question, and it's an economic question. Even though poverty itself may not give rise to terrorism, what it does do is it gives groups like Al Qaeda a place where they can operate and where they can gain the operational capability to do the things they did. While it might have emerged in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the ideological roots, it had to flourish in a lawless place like Afghanistan, where you don't have a very strong central government, you don't have this strong military to suppress these groups. So the question I would have, what have we learned since September 11 about development in these poor areas, and maybe not eliminating the place where these ideologies come from, but the places that create the conditions to foment something like Al Qaeda, or where they got Somalia, Afghanistan. I don't know. I think that we have not really looked, and ultimately, when we deposed Saddam, we had Iraq that for over 10 years had been subject to world sanctions, so it was ultimately very poor. What have we learned about that?
Well, I think that the poverty question is an element, but that it's an element that's stronger or weaker depending upon the context. For example, take the bombings in London. I mean, they were all done by British residents, many of whom were citizens, some of whom were I'm talking about the wider groups, not just some of whom were born there. So, to the extent that poverty was an element, it might be the acceptance by these people of a broader sense of their role in the world. For example, some people argue, well, how could it be poverty? Bin Laden was the son of a millionaire. The number two is a medical doctor whose father was a lawyer, and on and on. And the 19 hijackers, many of them were students. What's the name? The one who was the leader was a master's candidate in urban policy in Hamburg. But to me, that's a phony, because every organization will choose its leaders and operatives from the most capable people they have. I mean, they're not going to take illiterate peasants from Pakistan and send them to learn how to fly an airliner. I mean, it's crazy.
Isn't there another element, though, that terrorists are usually bourgeois?
Well, leaders. Leaders are often from a middle class or an intellectual group. But that doesn't mean that they can't accept a ideology and a political movement that tries to speak for people who are disenfranchised, including economic disenfranchisement. I'm not saying that poverty plays no role, but what the evidence suggests is that the existence of poverty is nowhere near sufficient to explain why terrorist groups use terrorist tactics. What is more important is when there are changes in people's conditions and how that affects their views of the future. So, for example, there is an increase in terrorist activities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during periods when the Israelis crack down more on the Palestinians. One of the things they do is they cut off access to jobs in Israel. That's partly, as an aside, why this whole notion of Palestine becoming a state, what hasn't been mentioned is that their resources are totally controlled by Israel. They make very little themselves, and what they get is largely from Israel funneling money to them or hiring workers from the West Bank to work in Israel. So they're gonna, if they become a state, they'll have almost no resources. So I'm not saying, it's not that poverty plays no role, but the role is much more subtle than simply saying, oh, poverty creates the conditions for terrorism. In fact, one widely cited number from the World Bank, that there are probably 1 billion people in the world who were living under conditions of what the World Bank describes as extreme poverty, which is living on $1.25 a day. Now, whenever I say that, I have to caution you, that doesn't mean they're living in Manhattan. $1.25 a day, what can you even buy these days for $1.25? It's a developing country attempt at a measure that could cut across countries. But that suggests that if 1 billion people are in extreme poverty, why aren't there more terrorists? I mean, 1 billion people is a huge number, and if poverty causes terrorism, we should see terrorism all over the place. Right? So, on the face of it, it's an argument that just doesn't ring true. But what does ring more true is to treat economic deprivation as a dynamic factor, particularly when things change rapidly, and how that affects people's views of their future. And when your view of your future is bleak, you're more willing to put your life on the line.
So he's right about where the terrorism, where you have to watch out for the
Could I just make one other addition to that, which is, I think that, lawless zones are preferred by terrorists. It's not that lawless zones create terrorists. So I mean that this is
Well, yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
So they move there for good
Bin
reasons.
Laden was kicked out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, he probably would have liked to have stayed there, but he was kicked out, and then he was kicked out of Somalia, Sudan. He was kicked out of Sudan. He was acting as a businessman in Sudan. Not a very successful one, by the way. He was losing money hand over fist. But his move to Afghanistan was because he was given safe haven. Now, your argument that it's a weak government is true, but there are other governments that might very well have given him safe haven, or less weak.
And it doesn't deal with your London bombing example and a lot of the other Madrid. They weren't using safe havens. They were in these places.
That's right. Now, they were they saw themselves as Al-Qaeda, but only, virtually.
Ideological.
Yeah, and not by any direct contact. There's no evidence that they had any direct contact with Al-Qaeda. But, the whole notion of there being a virtual Al-Qaeda, where other groups use Al-Qaeda as a model and learn from their operations, and whatever is online, that may be a reality. But the notion that they all fly to Pakistan to get trained by Al-Qaeda was ridiculous. It was really very mind-blowing. One other point I want to mention, which is a takeoff on Bill, when he said that a lot of this goes on without Congress really knowing about it. in terms of military use. One of the best examples, of course, is Charlie Wilson and the congressman from Texas who convinced the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, to allow him to divert some funds to the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. So the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan to kick the Soviet Union out was, initially at any rate, was funded clandestinely. Congress didn't know what he was doing. And it was one member of Congress with approval from the top, but it was all designed to be, don't tell anybody we're doing this. And they used it to buy weapons, including from Israel. So the interactions of all this are really incredible to follow through. I mean, it made him a star. They made a movie with Tom Hanks playing him.
Perry had a follow-up. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a somewhat different question. Well, first a comment about showing strength. Against Grenada, maybe Panama, but actually the U.S. hasn't won a war in a long time. I mean, Vietnam was not a win. Iraq, I don't think will in the end be a win, and Afghanistan is a total disaster. But assuming that there is not another terrorist attack in the United States.
How about Libya, though? It looks
looking
like a win.
Too soon to tell.
But we were not, no boots on the ground, right? So it's not.
We were a bit of a laggard. I mean, Sarkozy had to twist Obama's arm.
But right. maybe that's one of the lessons.
But that's not my question, which is that assuming that the CIA, FBI, etc., is clever enough to prevent another World Trade bombing, World Trade Center bombing, what happens then? Because the military, it also has to be cut back, right? I mean, it's agreed, right, that the military will have cuts. The war, I think there's a consensus we have to get out of Iraq. And I would imagine there's pretty much of a consensus. There's no point in being in Afghanistan anymore, especially as the Pakistanis are arranging, to kill, to attack Americans in as the chief. So, right. So, what happens next? What happens to the military over the next 5 years, assuming not another terrorist attack in the U.S.? Get cut back? Gets less ambitious.
I think it'll be cut back. I don't know.
In what, where, how,
Can I offer? I mean, all right. The DHS has a staff of about 45,000 people, bigger than the entire federal government of Canada. Right? We have fusion centers that are across the United States that are local police with the FBI, any one of which is probably larger than any intelligence force in any country in Europe. The notion that they'd be cut back might.
Who is?
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security.
Yeah. So
right.
The notion that there might be a cutback, I think, is maybe. But
no, I
so
was
what?
thinking
In a way, cut back to what? Yeah, cut back to what?
I wasn't thinking of that budget. I was thinking of.
But you mentioned FBI and CIA and.
Assuming that I wasn't saying. No, I was saying the Pentagon and the efforts to they have to have a military strategy of some sort. No longer fighting the Soviet Union. Maybe they want more boats in the Pacific, and those are expensive, and they, employ people in California and places like that. But what's the strategy? So where do they cut back? Smaller army, presumably. But what?
Do you think they're going to cut first grade?
I think they could cut 100,000. I don't know if they will, but I think it could be on the table. I mean, that's about what they added, late Bush and early Obama. That doesn't seem. If you don't cut forces, you don't save anything. But if you cut that number, you probably save $10 billion a year or something. So it's still in a $700 billion operation. It's not huge. But then also you're not buying equipment for them. You're not. It has an effect. But I think they'll reduce the force structure to some degree. I think they'll delay some of these weapons. They've got all these weapons in the pipeline. The Joint Strike Fighter, they'll buy half or less of what they're talking about now, and they'll spread it out over more years. In terms of strategy, that's always the question: do they ever have will they ever come out with a coherent strategy where they just throw everything in the air and hope for the best? But I think if they were to focus, I would think China would be kind of the long-term issue of China would be an important piece of it, partly because it's good for the Air Force and the Navy. You're not going to land Marines in China. And then I think, more of a counter-terrorist intelligence kind of approach. But I don't know whether that would translate. Whether you could have such a strategy, whether you could through all the bureaucracies and the pork barrel and the turf wars and whether you could actually structure a military that would be aligned with that strategy.
And for David, is there a peace dividend? I mean, does it contribute anything, or does it have the pro-cyclical effect of reducing spending when we need to increase it?
Well, if you look at the period since World War II, there's very little relation between the military spending cycles and the economic cycles. In fact, there have been far fewer spending cycles than economic cycles. So you really can't make an argument about whether it's intentionally pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical.
Right.
It may, by at certain times be
coincidence.
Yeah, but the notion that it's planned that way, the military responds much too slowly on both up and down, except like it responded fast in Korea, but that was the last time that there was a rapid buildup.
And it's a smaller and smaller piece of the economy compared to what it was.
It's about a third the size in terms of the share of GDP than it was in the 50s.
And wouldn't this be a bad time to cut jobs? I mean, these are employed people, right?
But that's the argument that all the contractors are going to use.
Well, you can turn it around and use it as an excuse, for domestic infrastructure. I mean, the highway system was built, for defense purposes.
In part, yes. Yeah.
And I had a National Defense Education Act loan that had absolutely zero to do with defense.
Oh, you could.
We assume that.
No, I mean, it was just, you say defense and you can get money.
Yeah. No, in those days, in the 50s and into the 60s, you could get training in all kinds of stuff. Learning languages, for example.
It could be useful.
But Bill, on the jobs point, I mean, if you do defense budget cuts, in the U.S., you do not have any near-term job cuts out of that, right? Because of the nature of defense programming. You start to hit it about 2 or 3 years out, which actually, depending on how bad our economy is, that might actually be a plus.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the nature of spending.
Now, what's your sense of, in terms of this year and next, in terms of contracting? Is everything out? Have they flushed everything out of the system, or do they have little bits of extra money they can toss out through the already it's programmed in the sense that Congress has appropriated and authorized, but hasn't been spent? What's the situation in terms of the spend out?
Well, it looks like there was a little document released of how the Senate was going to mark up the appropriations this year, and so they were going to cut budget authority by a certain amount. Not huge, but the first time they've cut it for a long time. But then if you looked at the outlays, they were much larger than the authority. So you've got this pent up, budgetary money that's sitting around ready to be spent. So I think if you cut budget authority now on weapon systems, you probably won't feel it in a substantial way for a couple of years. And the cuts they're talking about, the super committee wouldn't start until January 2013.
So the contractor's argument is basically fallacious, but it'd be hard for most people to understand because you can't put it on a bumper sticker. You know.
Yeah, I mean, they've been saying we'll lose, we'll add 1% unemployment tomorrow if you cut $1 more than what we're, up for. So they're definitely trying to exploit that. But then, I mean, there still are jobs involved. There's some jobs, and if they're in districts, if you're a member and it's actually only 200 jobs in your district instead of 600, you'll probably, behave the same way. In the way the budget bill is being structured, you're probably going to lose, unless they deal with revenues, you're going to lose jobs in other parts of the economy by keeping that money in the military. You're going to lose teachers, you're going to lose police officers and other.
A lot more jobs lost that way than.
Well, that assumes that money would be used to hire more teachers.
Well,
no, it's the reverse. They're going to cut.
They're going to cut it. They're going to cut.
Yes, I know. But if you cut defense faster, it doesn't mean you're going to increase spending because all this craziness about the debt.
You're saying they'll just drive the debt lower and they won't change the rate at which they lay off the teachers.
Or not raise taxes.
Or not raise taxes. Meanwhile, long-term interest rates are so low.
Right.
And if the markets were really concerned about the U.S. debt, why are long-term interest rates so low? I mean, it's crazy. I mean, nobody is seriously concerned about the U.S. debt except these idiots in Congress. Nobody is.
And they're actually not concerned either. They're actually not concerned either. They're using it.
Well, they're using it, of course. But in terms of the public, impressions, the real problems, I mean, you hear, I don't know if anyone spends time watching the Republican debates. I mean, it's
Just on the Daily Show.
yeah, right. But you get these people talking about the real crisis we have is all this debt, which is a burden on our grandchildren, and inflation. I mean, I'm saying, what world do you live in? If there's a problem now, it's not the debt and inflation, it's depression and deflation. I mean, inflation is as low as it's been, I don't know, it's like, what, 1%? And don't get me going on this. This is absolute madness. Yet this is what's dominating discussion. And the markets are...
No. You're done? All right, you're done.
Anyone? Because I have a couple of other things I can say.
Okay.
He's been saving up.
I thought he said not to get you going.
Not on that. There's just one other kind of thing about, whether history repeats itself. What was that famous phrase from Marx? Marx, all historical events tend to occur twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. In thinking about what was going on here in 2001, both before and then after 9/11, I mean, the neoconservative view of having to show force, and this was the time, and it was that famous quote, I think it was Ron Suskind who got it, one of these journalists, someone said to, maybe it was Woodward, someone said to him, you got to understand that we create the reality, we don't respond to it.
It was Suskind.
Suskind, right.
It's a great.
Yes. I mean, the arrogance that showed. And what it reminded me of a little bit is the early 60s. Now, I know most of you, a few of you might remember the early 60s. Most of you only have read about them. But when the Kennedy people came in, McNamara in defense, and some of the people in the national security, Rostow and Bundy, I mean, this was the takeover of the government apparatus by Harvard. And Harvard and MIT were going to bring in logical thinking, and we were going to create this whole cost-benefit approach. And we were going to do things much, much better than those idiots before us, which meant, of course, the Eisenhower administration.
It was actually Rand in Berkeley, wasn't it?
They brought in that stuff, but the people, the names are all the East Coast you know, Kennedy drew huge numbers of people from Cambridge and et cetera. And even McNamara had an MBA from Harvard, so he was known more for his corporate work, but he was also a part of it. And there was a similar tone of arrogance that all of you folks before us, you really don't know what you're doing. We're coming in and we've got all the ideas, and it's ideas that are going to dominate. And they would convene outsiders, and one of the most famous was they convened a group of scientists, and one of them was this guy named Murray Gell-Mann, G-E-L-L, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And this is all second, third-hand stuff. So, but they were talking about how should we deal with Vietnam, and his advice was, well, whenever you kill a Viet Cong, cut off their ears, and then show them to people. And that will be a sign about how we mean business. This was supposed to be what the best and the brightest. That's David Halberstam's book, was the best and the brightest, on how they totally screwed up Vietnam. I mean,
Not to mention the Bay of Pigs.
Not to mention, well, the Bay of Pigs, the planning of that was actually,
Eisenhower's crap.
yeah, I mean, the screwing up was Kennedy didn't stop it, but that was underway before Kennedy. But this notion that they knew how to do this better than anyone else was really kind of repeated by the Rumsfelds and Wolfowitz, not Powell. And I'm still wondering whether Powell's ever going to write a second memoir, his side of the story, now that Cheney has finally gotten his out. But there was a sense, again, that you don't need to look at history. History doesn't matter. Or successes and failures in the past don't matter. Because you've all been thinking about it in a totally wrong way. We've got the truth. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you read what some of these people said. Someone mentioned Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz. These were people that are considered to be the smartest people around. Not so much Rumsfeld, but anyway. And here's what they were saying. That's exactly what was going on in the Kennedy administration. These were the smartest people around.
But some of them had read history. I mean, some of them they just had a completely different interpretation of events.
But their lessons from history is that people in the past didn't know what they were doing. And we come at it with a different take. And of course, and by the way, I'll give you one more thing. Barry, you say we lost Vietnam. In one sense, yes, but in the long run, if you go back to Clausewitz's definition,
It's too soon.
look what Vietnam is today. It's a haven for business investment from the West.
Despite us, not because.
Well, but the real issue is...
Could have been 20
Yeah, well, wait a minute. Clausewitz says that war is an extension of politics. What were the politics of the period? To stop communist expansion. What happened?
Can I say something since you bring up that era? My first job actually started as an internship, but it ended up as a second summer as a job, was in what's now called the Office of Management and Budget. And yeah, we were introducing programming, planning, and budgeting, and cost-benefit analysis, and so on. And I don't say I was one of the. I mean, I was. It's very junior level. Very junior level. But when I went with people I was working with to talk with people in the labor department about how to forecast the budget for unemployment insurance, the federal part. You know, the guy said to me, if you have a model, don't sit down. Just, I mean, in other words, there is a permanent bureaucracy. And what happened with programming, planning, and budgeting is that the permanent bureaucracy figured out how these nutcases, how are we going to deal with these guys? And then the politicians as well. Oh, I want a post office in my district. You tell me you can't have it because the cost-benefit analysis says you can't. well, we got to fix the cost-benefit analysis, so it comes out. So, you know, it's like, yeah, yes, minister. I mean, there is this permanent government that somehow exists despite this layer that comes in from outside, you know, with right ideas. I don't know if that's good or bad, because that means all the bad practices continue.
Sure. And I'm not saying that this is, you know, the only thing that's going on, but if you look back, like, you know, you take the post-war period, there's a real almost cyclical pattern going on. You see it in military spending, but it's part of the same thing, where you get some kind of crisis, and everyone gets, oh, we got to deal with this, and they deal with it, and then afterwards, everything sort of peters out, and then you get a group who say, well, the way you dealt with it didn't work, and we're going to be smarter than you, and we're going to deal with it differently. And then they have their crisis, and then everything gets built up, and then afterwards everything sort of depresses, and these people all leave government.
If you think it's bad in the Pentagon, just look at the education policy.
But then, you know, these people all leave government, and the new group comes in and says, oh, they screwed it up. We know how to do it better. And then you go through the same thing again. We've been through it at least 3 times. 4 if you count the Reagan buildup. Korea, Vietnam, and since 9/11, we've been through it 3 times, and the results are pretty much the same each time.
Isn't that partially, though, you know, if a new president is elected, nobody wants to come, you know, to work in Washington unless there's some promise that there's an enormous change that is possible under the rubric of the new presidency. I mean, that's why people work for an administration, right? Up until during the election time,
Yeah,
they say,
to a point.
"I'm going to come to Washington and I'm going to make change happen," because the other bozos didn't know how to do it. That's the game.
And that's partly how people get elected. And we've had that.
So what happened to Obama? He brought in all the wrong people.
Yes, he did.
Right in the Clinton crowd.
Well, the scary thing about this new Susskind book, aside from the fact that apparently he's been misquoting people, but that's another issue, is that
That's what they say.
They say.
well, no, there's some evidence on that. There's some people. One person at least has released the tape recording, and he left out a crucial part of the quote. Anyway, that's another story. But Larry Summers comes across as the liberal. My God. I mean, in any rational world, Larry Summers is a centrist, but in this, of all the people Obama brought in, it was, well, Christy Romer, and then Summers is supporting Romer on this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Against Geithner.
Against Geithner and against Rahm Emanuel saying, oh, no, we can't do it.
And, you know, and Summers' history is by no means.
But Feldstein was on the same side. So go figure.
Thank our speakers for the. We'll see you next time.
So, did you see excerpt? Stuart had the excerpt.
Motion to
What did we do?
Good.